Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Shabbat HaGadol Drasha, Pikesville Jewish Congregation's annual Drasha in preparation for Pesach. The Shabbat HaGadol Drasha is supposed to be a special time where our community gathers together to study together, to prepare for Pesach, both practically and spiritually. Traditionally, the Shabbat HaGadol Drasha is focused on halachic matters. It's focused on specifically spiritually oriented matters that are focused on how to best observe the holiday of Pesach. It's no secret that Pesach itself is a complicated holiday. It's a hard holiday to observe to its fullest, and Shabbat HaGadol is the unique opportunity for our community to prepare together, to think about all the different details of what we have to get ready. This evening, we are offering to you both a practical opportunity to prepare, practical advice on how to get ready for this special holiday, and hopefully we'll be spending some time preparing spiritually to think about how we're getting ready for this holiday spiritually. I am really happy, really honored this evening to welcome with us Laura Franks, member of our community. Laura is an entrepreneur. For anyone who's watching from Baltimore knows that Laura and Larry are owners of Accents and Serengeti and Sapori, and provide food and are incredibly generous across the Baltimore Jewish community. And we are very fortunate to have Larry and Laura as part of our shul, as part of our community. And I wanted to invite Laura to prepare us this evening for the Chag practically. Laura is going to take us through a couple of ideas, a couple of recipes for how to make a delicious Charoset recipe this year. Once Laura is done, we will dive into the spiritual preparation. So I am so happy. Thank you, Laura, for joining us. I'm going to give the screen to you. Thank you very much and enjoy.
Thank you, Rabbi, and welcome, and hello to everybody. We've definitely missed seeing you in person, and please God, by the next Chag, Shavuos, please God, we'll all be able to come together in a meaningful way in all of our congregations. So Rabbi Shaffer asked me to present a couple of ways to do Charoset, and I was actually glad he made that suggestion because we've kind of been boring in our house for many years, just doing the same old charoset that I grew up with, which is just a kind of basic Ashkenaz charoset, which I'll talk about in a minute. And yet, for the past few years, I personally have always received a very special gift. We had a Persian mashgiach who worked for us for many years, and even though he retired and he no longer works for us, every year he arrives at my door with a Persian charoset, and everybody in my house knows that it's hands off. That's especially mine. It's my absolute treat, and I sit with a spoon and I eat it, and it's unique and it's amazing and it's different. So we have the traditional Ashkenazi charoset for everyone at my Seder, and then I got my little treat thing going on the side here, which is kind of fun. But then when Rabbi asked me to present with Charosets, I did a little bit of research, and what I'm going to show you tonight are some kind of ways to jazz up your Charoset and do something a little different this year, because listen, this year has been different. We have been in an unprecedented 12 months. So let's finish it off and round it off with something that's a little bit of a curveball and not so straight down the line. So before I start, I just wanted to mention that I see the Rabbi also put my little health coaching thing tagged onto the back of my name. So yes, I am also a health coach in addition to a restaurateur. And I just have to say, from that perspective, I have not yet figured out a way to make healthy Charoset, because truly everything you see here is like really high in sugar. So I will just make that disclaimer. None of these Charosets are anything that I would term healthy, just because they do run high in sugar. But listen, just once a year, we're going to enjoy. We want to have a beautiful Seder, so tuck in, get out a spoon, and have fun. Another thing I just wanted to mention that I always encourage people to do when I'm doing food demonstrations or working with clients is personalize, personalize, personalize. Take something and make it your own. So if you love certain nuts and fruits, then integrate those into your Charoset. especially if you have kids in the house. Why start making walnuts or hazelnuts and wine and stuff if you know that that is just not something that's going to be palatable to your family? So go out of the box, figure out what everybody really does like, other than peanuts, because obviously we can't use those, and just get that all going on in your blender, and turn it into something that everyone around your table is going to enjoy experiencing during the Seder. So I wanted to kick off by just going through what I term as like a basic Ashkenaz Charoset. And I've got this mise en place. Mise en place is a fancy name for like all your little ingredients in an organized fashion. But I have my little mise en place of a basic Ashkenaz Charoset. So I'll read off what's on this little tray as my cheat sheet. We've got, of course, apples. And this is an entire apple sliced. We've got some walnuts and almonds. Now, when I grew up, my mom only used walnuts. My husband happens to be allergic, so we try not to do that in our house. But I'm going to blend these. And then we've got our sweetening agents. I got a mixture of some golden raisins and dates. I've got about a quarter cup of walnuts and an eighth of a cup of almonds and a quarter cup of dates and raisins. You obviously want to scale that up for quantity. And then my little seasonings, I've got some, about a half a teaspoon of powdered ginger and half a teaspoon of cinnamon and about an eighth of a cup of red wine. So that's all going to go into my blender in a moment. But before we do all of the charosets, I just wanted to show you what I'm using tonight. I'm just using a light red sweet Rashi wine. But you can use whatever you like. And I know people tend to go with darker, heavier, sweeter wines. I just figured that there's already so much sugar on this tray that all you really want is the flavor of the alcohol. And we're not really going for like another giant jump in terms of sweetness. So when you're going to make your charoset, what you obviously want to do is blend down the hardest ingredients first. And those are going to be, on this tray, the dates are the toughest thing. Be sure to buy pitted dates if you're going to use them, just FYI, because you stick these little puppies in that thing with a pit and you've got a really like not happy blade in your Cuisinart. So I would put the dates in first and then my nuts, which are the hardest things. So we're just going to blend those up. Just a quick little blend. Get this thing working. And you don't have to get too carried away because it's going to go a few more times. We're going to dump in the golden raisins. And then I'm going to dump in my apples. I never, ever peel my apples when I do charoset. Just FYI. Some people sit there and they take the pits out and they peel it and they chop it. And for me, that's just way too much work, Erev Chag, when there's just so many other things to do. And there's so much health benefit to eating the skin anyway. So I always leave the skin out. Nice and blended. And then the last thing you want to do is your liquid and your seasonings. Get rid of all my handy dandy little plastic containers. Get that. Now, I guess it's supposed to be a paste, right? Because we are technically forming the mortar of the bricks in Mitzrayim. So here we go, and I'm going to show you the consistency of this, what I term my basic Ashkenaz charoset, although it probably even has a couple more ingredients than a basic recipe. Very, very basic recipe would be your wine, apples, nuts, and cinnamon. That would be like the most basic, but this is way more interesting, and you can see the texture, very mortary. So that's the first one, which is, smells really good. You can smell those apples and cinnamon. Then I have another twist. Also, for me, this is an Ashkenaz, and I'll explain to you why I say it's Ashkenaz in a minute. Another, which is just a little bit more of a modern twist. Instead of using walnuts, I've got pistachios. I've got about a quarter cup of pistachios and about a half a cup of cranberry. That is just a yummy combination. Tastes a little bit more like fall. So again, I'm going to put the fruit and the nuts in first and chop them just a little bit because apples are really soft. If you put your apples in from the beginning, they're going to puree. Now, maybe you like a pureed kind of a charoset, and that's fine, but I like mine to have a little bit more body. So I'm going to do my cranberries and my pistachios. Excuse the noise. And again, it doesn't have to be super fine because you're going to keep going with a few other ingredients and you want it a little bit chunky. And then I've got here a half an apple. Now, remember, I'm just doing small quantities tonight. So if you're taking notes, you're going to want to double, triple, quadruple based on the number of people at your table. So my half a cup cranberries, quarter cup pistachios, a half an apple. And then I've got my little half a teaspoon or quarter teaspoon cinnamon, depends on how much cinnamon you like. Some people aren't a big fan of major amounts of cinnamon, and I get that. And then I've got literally like an eighth of a cup of wine. But again, if you want yours to be more moist and softer, certainly can keep adding until you're happy. Personalize, 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 and make it your own. I'm going to blend that out. I'm going to take a look. This one, because of the cranberries and more specifically the pistachios, this is definitely a drier charoset. So again, you may want to add a bit more apple and wine if you want it to be more of a paste. This one is more crumbly than a paste. It's just an entirely different texture, and because it's made with cranberry and pistachio, it's an entirely different flavor. A little bit more unexpected and kind of blingy, if I can use that word. I don't really know how else to term it, but it's definitely a little bit more jewel tone, blingy kind of a charoset, but it's fun. And in my house, personally, we're big pistachio nut fans. So this would go down really well with my kids. So again, you can see it's very thick. It's your mortar. But for sure, puree it down, add some more apple and a bunch more wine if you just want it to be sort of more porridgey and loosey. And some people like that. It works for them. So those are what I term my Ashkenaz-orientated, more mainstream apple, walnut, wine-based charosets. Then in front of me here, I've got another mise en place. And the reason I say this is more Sephardi, because the Sephardim seem to go, well, first of all, dates feature way more heavily in their charosets, and a lot of them. This is about a half a pound of dates, about 8 ounces. They also like the darker raisins, like they're not using the light raisins. So for me, a basic, more Sephardi orientated charoset is going to start out with a lot of dates. Now, when you put dry dates like this into a blender, it still takes a while to break them down because they are fibrous. You can see they're fibrous, and they're hard to work with. They're not super pliable. So if you want to make it easier and a little bit more of a smoother consistency, you may want to plump these up in a little bowl of boiling water. Then you can even add your boiling water infused, the date infused water into your charoset if you'd like to use it as part of your mixture. But the way I've done this now, it's going to take some work to puree these right down. So this is going to end up being a chunky charoset as well. So again, you start off with your hardest elements to blend down, which is my 8 ounces of dates. And I've got here about maybe half a cup of dark raisins. And then to that, I'm going to add a half a cup of red wine and a half an apple. Now, again, if you're scaling up for volume, you're going to want to double that or even triple it or quadruple it. You can see. That's super happy. This blend is not super happy with all this thick ingredients. But when we add the apple and wine, it's going to help to puree it down a little bit. Now, interesting enough, this does not have this doesn't have any cinnamon in it at all. You can add But this particular basic Sephardi recipe doesn't have those seasonings in. But it does have a lot more apple and wine, a lot more than the recipes that I've just done. Now I could let this go longer, and had my dates been soaked previously, and I got them really late from work, so that's why I didn't have time to do it myself. But had they, this would be way more of a paste than what it is, but it is already much more moist and runny than the two previous recipes. And again, it's just a personal preference, whatever your taste is. Also, as I'm scraping this, because the alcohol content is way higher than the others, I mean, that wine, the aroma of the wine is just hitting me. It's beautiful. It's amazing and delicious, but it's a lot more. So maybe for kids, may want to scale it down or rethink it. But you can see this. This is pretty chunky, as I said before. I probably would tend to soak the dates in some boiling water to soften them. That'll get a little bit more pureed, but I can smell that it's delicious because I can just smell the sweetness of the dates and the alcohol. It's going to be yum. Oh, no, I'm going to hang on to this and I'll tell you why. I'm going to put it back in here. Because my jazzed up version, and there's a jazzed up version, because why not? We're going all in this thing. We're going to make it super interesting, and we're going to see the back end of this pandemic with a yummy, yummy Seder. So my jazzed up version is taking that base of dates, apple, wine, and raisins, and then adding a bunch more things in to really take this to the next level in terms of content and flavor. So I've taken 3 different nuts here. Again, I wouldn't use walnuts in my house because my husband is allergic, but you could use a hazelnut. You really could use whatever you wanted. I've got here maybe a 1/4 cup of, looks like a 1/4 cup walnuts, pistachio, and almonds. So I'm going to throw all 3 of those nuts into that base mixture. This time I'm going to add my pinch of cinnamon. And in a lot of Sephardi recipes that I've seen, they also add dried apricots and prunes. I've just got 4 apricots and 4 prunes here. I'm going to add those in too. And then we're going to blend that down just a little. Now it's really going into a bit more of a paste. We've got a lot more stuff in it. A really sticky paste. You can thin it down with some wine if you want. And then there's going to be a couple of surprise ingredients, things you would not necessarily expect. I'm going to add some banana. And the reason I'm doing that is because my special Persian Charoset that I get as a gift every year from my previous gift for sure has banana in it. And I think that's what makes it so like Moorish and addictive. And it also has pomegranate seeds in. So I'm going to put some pomegranate seeds in. And you can add some when you're done too. I think I'm going to add a bit more liquid to this. Just going to add a dash more wine. Just to loosen it up a tad. And then, I can smell that banana. It smells really good. So we're going to blend that up. That is starting to look like what I get as a gift every year. And I will show you, turn it back into this container because I've already used it, so it's already dirty. Can you see it going in? It's like this thick paste. It is the smell amazing. I cannot begin to tell you how amazing it is. I'm almost positive the version I get has rose water in. However, I do know that rose water for a lot of people is an acquired taste. And so if I was preparing this for a mostly Ashkenazi table or clientele, I would hesitate to put rose water in because I know it's not everybody's cup of tea. So that's why I didn't add it to this particular recipe. But this is beautiful. And what you can do if you're going to add these ingredients is you can just toss some more amazing pomegranate seeds in when you're done. And look how beautiful this looks. And it smells incredible. So that's like the super jazzed up, Sephardic orientated charoset on steroids. Everything in the kitchen sink, but it's yum. So that's what I've got for you tonight, guys. And I hope you will be inventive, and I hope it will be delicious, and I hope you will have an amazing, amazing Chag, and be able to celebrate with some family. And Larry and I look forward to seeing all of you in the very near future. So thank you for your invitation, Rabbi, and Chag Kasher v'Sameach to everybody.
Chag Kasher v'Sameach. Please send my best to Larry, and that I could smell that lost charoset from here. It looks amazing.
I'll drop some tomorrow.
Thank you so much. Chag Kasher v'Sameach.
Thank you. Good night.
Okay, let's dive into some of the spiritual preparation. Now that Laura has how to prepare for the charoset practically, and it was not planned that she would talk about the reason behind the charoset, but it is convenient that she went there because we're going to discuss the symbolism of that mortar, the symbolism of the cement that the Jewish people used to build the pyramids in Egypt. We're going to talk about what is that all about. I want to start from a different place. March 20th, 2013, 8 years ago, was the first time in my life I was leaving a job. I was an assistant rabbi in a medium large shul out in Eastern Long Island, and Eliza and I had had a child, had Bensi, had our son, our oldest son, and Eliza was traveling into the end. It became impossible for us to stay in Eastern Long Island. So March 20th, 2013 was my last day in that job, and I was heading into unemployment. Unemployment is a daunting, it's a difficult disposition. It's difficult to figure out how to go into unemployment. And then on my final day in the job, on this day, March 20th, yesterday, the anniversary, I went over to a plant that a colleague had given me the first day I arrived in that job a year and a half earlier. And I picked it up and I walked it over to her and I was giving it back to her. I was leaving the job. I was returning this beautiful plant that blossomed every month. It was a gorgeous plant, and I put it in her hands and I wished her goodbye and I thanked her for her friendship and for being a good colleague. And she pointed out that there was a new sprout, which was very unusual because it was just one plant. But the day that I was leaving that job, there was a new sprout. And I found, I took a picture of it that I share with you on the screen now. And I found this to be very symbolic, right? As you're diving into the unknown, as you're heading into troubled waters, as I didn't know what the future would be, the fact that the day that I left, this symbolic plant sprouted was incredibly significant for me. So I want to start our exploration of Charoset, of talking about what Charoset is. Lara already gave a hint to the difficulty that it represents, but I want to understand it even further. I want to explore it even further and see how we can understand its meaning, its symbolism, maybe a little bit more. Where to start when you're talking about Charoset? None other than Ben & Jerry's Passover, Pesach ice cream. If there has to be a state of Israel, then there has to be a Ben & Jerry's Charoset flavored ice cream that is made in the state of Israel. Let's quickly read this article together. This article was published 5 years ago. Ben & Jerry's, the ice cream empire that churns out quirky flavors inspired by American pop culture, has a new flavor inspired by something completely different, a ritual food eaten on Passover. The limited edition flavor is a pint of creamy vanilla ice cream with a swirl of charoset, a fruit and nut compote Jews will eat on the Friday night of Passover, a holiday that marks the biblical exodus from Egypt. Charoset, which symbolizes the mortar the ancient Israelites used as slave laborers in Egypt, comes from the Hebrew word for clay. It may not sound like a very good ice cream ingredient, but people are screaming for the stuff. A limited batch was made this month at the Ben & Jerry's factory in the southern Israeli town of Be'er Tuvia. It's the only Ben & Jerry's factory in the world where you can see workers touching the mezuzah, the slender case containing a prayer scroll that's attached to the doorpost of Jewish homes and other buildings before taking a seat on the production line. Avi Zinger, who leads the Israeli factory, says on the phone has been ringing off the hook at the Ben & Jerry's headquarters in Vermont. Americans are desperate for the Pesach pint, but the flavor is only being sold in Israel and just for the holiday. People are calling Vermont, asking where they can get it, and it's not available, Singer says, standing inside the factory. Meanwhile, Ben & Jerry's reps in Vermont are calling Zinger, to figure out what this flavor is all about. The flavor experts at Vermont headquarters, the flavor gurus as they're called, weren't actually involved in the making of the Passover flavor. In true Israeli irreverence, the local factory kind of just did it on its own. They're not familiar with the Charoset, Zinger admits. So we think we are familiar with Charoset, right? Laura already, unscheduled, revealed the great reveal that Charoset, the reason we have Charoset at our Seder table is to commemorate the mortar, to commemorate the clay that the Jewish people used to build the pyramids. But let's examine that a little bit closer, because we know, you and I know, that people's love for Charoset has no ends. Described in that article, Charoset was the favorite food of the Seder table, the most flavorful food of the Seder table. Right? Cultures have been built around Charoset. So let's take a look at the most important rabbinic sage of the last 1,000 years, the Rambam. Let's take a look and see what he says. How does he understand what the Charoset is supposed to be? HaCharoset mitzvah medivrei sofrim zeicher latit shehayu ovdim bo Mitzrayim. The Charoset is a commandment from the scribes, from the rabbinic sages, in remembrance of the clay with which they would work in Egypt. So the Rambam agrees with our assumption that the Charoset is to commemorate the clay. But is that the exclusive reason behind the Charoset? It seems unusual, right? It's a night of joy. It's a night of freedom. It's a night in which we celebrate going out of Egypt. And yet we place in the front and center of the table the clay that we used to build pyramids with, the clay that we used when we were in servitude. And the Rambam offers us a recipe. He offers us ingredients. What goes in this clay? Dates and figs, raisins. Crush them up, put vinegar and spice in it to make it like clay with straw. We place that Charoset on the table, the Rambam says. We pay homage to the bitterness of slavery through Morah. Right? It's at the table. The bitterness, the recognition of the slavery is at the table. But why are we insisting to expand on it? Why aren't we focused on the freedom? Why aren't we focused on the fact that we are now living like kings? We're now free people to worship God. Why do we insist to place the clay on the table? The Maggid Mishnah, one of the classic commentaries on the Rambam, says, hang on 1 second. Hold on. Hold your horses, Rambam. It's not the case. As is the way in Jewish life, there's an argument about exactly what the symbolism of the Charoset is. He draws our attention to the Gemara in Pesachim, Kuf Yud Daled Amud Aleph. But Mishnah, Afal Pi She'ein Charoset Mitzvah, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Tzadok, Omer Mitzvah. There is this great debate. Is Charoset a mitzvah? Is it not a mitzvah? We might touch on it a little bit later, but assuming it's not a mitzvah, what is it all about? What's the point of the Charoset? Is it simply to commemorate the mortar, like the Rambam said? He says, my mitzvah, what is the mitzvah of Charoset? What are we commemorating? Rabbi Levi comes along and says, Zeichel tapuach aura harticha. Rabbi Yochanan Omer Zeichel latit. Rabbi Yochanan says that it is to commemorate the mortar. And that is what has shaped our Jewish attitude towards Charoset, is we put the cement on the table, and that's what we're commemorating. But there's another opinion. There's another important opinion. Zeichel tapuach. It's to commemorate this thing called tapuach. Hold on to the tapuach for me for 1 minute. So where are we on Charoset so far? Charoset is to remember the tough times. Charoset is to create an environment where we recall how difficult it was to build those pyramids, just how difficult it was to be enslaved, to have to make the mortar and build it, and it has to be thick and it has to be heavy. The symbolism is significant. But what is this tapuach reference? So I want to draw your attention to a wonderful book, the Encyclopedia of Jewish Food, written by Gil Marks, published in 2010. He offers us a beautiful description of what charoset is. Let's read it quickly together. Charoset is a fruit mixture used at the Passover Seder for dipping maror, dipping bitter herbs. The charoset also accompanies the bitter herbs along with the matzah in the korech sandwich, the Hillel sandwich. Interestingly, most of the early rabbinic sages and all the Jewish communities also required karpas to be immersed in the charoset. Maimonides instructed that all ritual foods of the Seder, including the matzah, be dipped into it. Many Yemenites who generally follow Maimonides maintain the custom of dipping karpas in the charoset. On the other hand, today Ashkenazim and most Sephardim dip the karpas into salt water or wine vinegar, reserving charoset exclusively for the bitter herbs. Charoset, already in widespread use by the time the Mishnah was written in approximately 200 CE. It is unquestionably the most flavorful and arguably everyone's favorite food at the Seder. The institution of charoset as with much of the Seder, was not mandated by the Bible, but rather derived from Greco-Roman practices 2,000 years ago. Attendees at the Seder were expected for that evening to emulate the practices of nobility and free people. And at the table of the Roman elite, greens were always accompanied with the dressing of condiments. The emergence of charoset was probably influenced by the fruit relishes served at the Roman symposium, although the ingredients of the original charoset were based on Middle Eastern produce. In effect, the use of the charoset has the same effect as the custom of dipping of the karpas at the onset of the Seder reclining during the Seder. These practices are all intended to produce an overall sense of affluence, aristocracy, and atypicality for the Seder. And so we find ourselves in this strange place where the charoset, the reason the charoset comes to the table, the reason it is there is to create the environment of freedom, to make us feel like we are Roman aristocracy, to create an atypicality at the Seder table. And it's a later addition. It's an addition that the sages introduce specifically to create a regal environment. And they have to add symbolism to the experience. And what symbolism do they choose? They take that which is a delicacy and they say, oh, by the way, it commemorates the slavery. It commemorates the hardship. Why do our sages take the mortar that direction? We drink 4 cups of wine on the Seder night to commemorate, to feel the freedom. Why not say charoset, this fruit paste, is there to enhance the level of freedom? I'll add one more thought on this. The Mishnah discusses, is charoset a mitzvah, is it not a mitzvah? It's a long debate, it's a long discussion, which has interesting ramifications over whether you say a bracha for charoset or not. The Rambam seems to have this debate. In one place, he holds that it is a mitzvah. In another place, he says it's a mitzvah medivrei sofrim. It's a rabbinic mitzvah, as we saw earlier tonight. But then the Gemara comes on Daf Kuf Tes Zayin Amud Aleph. The Gemara comes to this interesting place. It says, let's assume charoset is not a mitzvah. If it's not a mitzvah, v'ila mitzvah, mishamai maisila. Why is it at the Seder? Why is it there? What does it say? What it doesn't say is it's there to commemorate the tit. It's there to commemorate the mortar. What it does say is there, Amar Rabbi Ame. Rabbi Ame comes along and says, Mishum kafa. He says, there is a poison in the maror. There's a bitterness in the maror. And what are we supposed to do with that bitterness? We're supposed to take the maror and dip it in the charoset to dull the bitterness, to limit the impacts, the effects of the poison on limit the impacts of the effects on the poison on us. And so the Talmud itself comes to this conclusion that the Charoset is there to sweeten that which is bitter. It's there to dull the effect of the avdas. It's there to make maror, to make that which is inedible much more edible. And so why do we insist that the Charoset is there to commemorate the mortar? There are so many more positive reasons to have the Charoset. Why are we insisting that we bring ourselves back to the experience of slavery through a substance that is beloved, through a substance that people love to eat, through a substance that is there to enhance our Seder, to make it aristocratic, that is there to dull the effects of the Mara? Over and over again, we see that the Charoset is in the status of the 4 cups of wine. It is an expression of freedom. So why do our sages insist to give it the symbolism that it is Mara, that it is bitter, that it is about the avdas, it is about the slavery? The Charoset seems to be a positive item, saving us from the full bitterness of the Mara. Let's explore the Charoset a little bit further. So remember, the Talmud presents 2 reasons behind the symbolism of Charoset. 2 opinions. One opinion is the famous opinion, the opinion of Rabbi Levi, that says the Charoset is there to commemorate the mortar that we used to build the pyramids. What's the other reason? Zecher latapuach orarticha. What is this tapuach? This is a reference to a pasuk in Shir HaShirim, a cryptic pasuk found in the 8th chapter, the 5th verse of the Song of Songs. Mi zos olam min hamidbar, misrapekes al doda, tachas hatapuach orarticha, shama chiblascha imecha, shama chibla yoladascha. Who is she that comes up from the desert leaning upon her beloved? Under the apple tree I roused you. It was there your mother conceived you, and there she bore you. Let's try to understand what this tapuach is referring to. We know in modern Hebrew, tapuach means an apple. In fact, there's this common phrase that such and such person is the apple of his eye. A child is the apple of a parent's eye. A spouse is the apple of the spouse's eye. The phrase apple of the eye is a very old phrase, over 1,000 years old. In fact, it makes its way into one of Shakespeare's plays, A Midsummer Night's Dream, the 3rd act. One of the characters says, flower of this purple dye, hit with Cupid's archery, sink in the apple of his eye, when his love he doth espy. Let her shine as gloriously as the Venus of the sky. When thou wakest, if she be by, beg of her for remedy. The apple of the eye becomes this phrase that makes its way into Shakespeare. Where does it come from? So if you ask a linguist, he'll tell you it's first mentioned by William the Conqueror 1,000 years ago in 1066. But I think perhaps there's another reference. There's another act, there's another story that is so much more ancient that perhaps helps us understand the phrase apple of his eye as an act of love, an act of dedication. I want to draw your attention to the midrash that you see in front of you. I deliberately did not translate this midrash. Generally, I will never present for you a source without a translation, but this midrash is such a stunning, beautiful story that I wanted you to hear the story, not read the story. I wanted you to hear the story and follow along with me in the Hebrew. The Midrash asks a basic question that I never thought of, but is such a fundamental, important question. We know that Paro was a genocidal maniac. We know that Paro was committed to wiping out, to creating a Holocaust, wiping out all the baby boys of the Jewish people. So the Rabbi Yehuda in the Midrash asks a simple question. He wants to know, how did the children survive? How is it that they survived Paro's genocidal intentions? And the Midrash paints for us this remarkable story. The children that Paro wants to throw into the Nile, the children that Paro wanted to destroy, wants to kill, it was those children that recognized God. How did they recognize God? What is this talking about? Kishahoyu Yisrael b'Mitzrayim, when Israel was in Egypt. Vayisa isha mibnos Yisrael mevakeshet leiled, when a Jewish woman was ready to give birth. Vayisa yotzeis l'sadeh veyoledes sham. Remember, it was dangerous to give birth at home. They had spies paying attention to the pregnant women, and when a child was born, they would come in and they would murder that child. So it was dangerous to stay at home. So what did these remarkable Jewish women do? They went out to the apple orchard and they gave birth there. The Talmud fills in the picture a little bit, fills in the backstory a little bit. Why do these women end up in the apple orchard? They end up in the apple orchard because that's where the child was created. You see, intimacy in the midst of Egypt was not such a simple thing to achieve. Intimacy and privacy, which is such a Jewish value, was not so easy to achieve when you were enslaved. And so husbands and wives would go out to the apple orchard, to the privacy of the apple orchard, to be intimate with each other, to conceive this child. Imagine the love. Imagine the faith in the midst of slavery. Imagine the faith to want to bring a child into the world. Imagine the commitment that they had to each other. At the end of the day, to sneak out to the apple orchard, to be in each other's arms, in privacy. What happens when this child is born? The mother can't bring the child home. The child's life is in danger. And so the new mother offers a prayer. Our Midrash says the following. V'omeres. What happened? They handed the child over to God. Ki'ilu. V'omeres ribon ha'olam. They would say, Master of the world, Ani asiti et shali, va'ata asei et shelach. I've done my responsibility. I've done my part. Now, God, it's up to you to do your part. Now it's up to you to save these children. We have remained dedicated to the future. We've brought another Jewish child into the world. I can't keep this child safe. Now it's up to you, God, this mother says. Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Miyad haya yored HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvodo k'v'yachal v'choseich tiburan u'marchitzan v'sachan. So effective was the prayer of these Jewish mothers that God himself came down to that apple orchard and bathed and cleansed those babies, made them beautiful. V'haya nosen shnei tinarin biyado, echad meniko v'shemen ve'echad meniko dvash. He had 2 stones in his hand, one that he would give to the children and they would suckle on it and out would come oil, and another out would come honey. God looked after the babies in Egypt and strengthened them. And can you imagine, years later, when the child was 13, 14, 15, was old enough that it was safe to go home, they returned to their homes. Eitzel avoseyan. They went to their parents. Can you imagine the stunned reaction? I had given up my child years ago, never expecting to see the child again. I gave up my child with a prayer. And the prayer came true. And their parents would say, Shalin lehem mi haya zakak lechem. Who protected you? Who looked after you? Who kept you safe? V'hayu olim lehem bachor echad na'eh u'meshubach haya yored va'oseh lanu chol sarchenu Bachar achad na'er u'meshubach. There was a praiseworthy, beautiful young man who looked after us in this field, was dedicated to looking after us. Listen to how this midrash concludes. V'chein shabo Yisrael liyam. When the Jewish people were walking through the Yam Suf, when the sea split and the Jewish people saw the incredible miracle, these children were there with them. They were with the Jewish people. They saw God himself. They turned to their parents and they said, Abba and Ima, Zehu Oso, this is the Bachar Na'em Meshubach. This is the young man who looked after us. Oselanu kolosan hadvarim. He did for us everything we need. K'shayinu b'Mitzrayim, when we were young, vulnerable in Egypt, he did everything that we need. And then they turned around and said, Zeh ke'liva anvehu. This is our God. It was those children who were nourished, who were kept safe by God, that helped their parents see God at the sea. Help their parents identify God at the sea. The Sfas Emes says, when we left Egypt, we left as Avdei Hashem. When we walked through the Yam Suf, we became Banim La Hashem. What happened? What does that mean? We were servants to God when we left Egypt. We became children to God in the Yam Suf. When we left Egypt, we thought we were going from one master to another. One taskmaster, one brutal lord to another brutal lord. We were going from being Avdei Mitzrayim to Avdei Hashem. Only when God rescues us, only when God saves us, only when the Jewish people hear their children say, Zeh ke'li v'anvehu, Bachar na'er meshubach. There is this being that is beautiful and generous, that will split the sea. That's when we transform from being Avdei Hashem to Banim Hashem, from being Sagad to being children of God. The story of the Tapuach is the story of the Jewish people finding sweetness in the bitterness of slavery. It's faith in the apple fields. It's intimacy in the midst of indignation. We have to stop and think of the famous midrash where Miriam's parents decide they're going to stop being intimate with each other. They're going to stop because what's the point of bringing children into the world if Paro is going to kill the Jews? And Miriam turns to her parents and says, Abba and Ima, what you're doing is worse than what Paro is doing. Only Paro is killing the boys. You're preventing the boys and the girls from coming into this world. Miriam insists that we find sweetness, that we find love in the midst of Egypt. Miriam insists that the context of slavery, the context of bitterness, should not hold us back from thinking about the future. Shouldn't hold us back from being fully present in this moment here now. I bring you back to the Encyclopedia of Jewish Food. He does something amazing. He refers the first recipe, the oldest recipe he could find of Charoset, was from the 9th century. In the book of Sadia Gaon, he writes, make a moist sauce from dates, walnuts, and sesame, and knead it with red wine vinegar. It's called chalek, which apparently is still a dish in the Middle East today. And he says, note the absence of the apples or any fresh fruit. Sadia also used chalek, still a common Central Asian synonym for charoset. Listen to the last paragraph. Rabbi Eliezer ben Judah of Worms, of France, who wrote an amazing book called the Rokeach, reflecting on the Ashkenazic position shortly after the disasters of the First Crusade, instructed the following. Charoset is made from tapuchim. Charoset is made from apples, into which is added a little of the fruits from the Song of the Songs, from the Shir HaShir. In that chapter, there are fruits mentioned: walnuts, figs, pomegranates, pepper, ginger, cumin, horseradish. Yes, charoset for pungency, and black radish. You have to understand who the Rokeach was. The Rokeach was this prolific author at the end of the 12th century, the beginning of the 13th century, who was writing his commentary right around when the First Crusade began. And history tells us that the Rokeach witnessed the Crusaders murder his wife and his only child. In the middle of writing his commentary on the Torah, there is a stark difference between the commentary that he writes before witnessing that terrible act and after witnessing that terrible act. And so he's the one who introduces tapuach into the charoset. He is the oldest source for including apples, including sweetness in the charoset. Someone who understood terrible, terrible bitterness. Someone who himself witnessed the awful reality of anti-Semitism. He insists that a charoset can not only be about the mortar, but it also has to be zeicher latapuach. And it has to remind us of the love, of the connection. It has to remind us of that moment where at the end of a hard day, the Jewish husband and wife in Egypt still insisted on being with each other, no matter what they saw. We've lost a lot of people this year. We lost a lot of our chachamim, our leaders. Rav Steinsaltz translated the Talmud. He wrote a commentary on the Talmud. He wrote this magnificent book called On Being Free. He writes the following: freedom and slavery appear to be the opposite from each other, each defined as the absence of the other. Slavery is the absence of freedom, freedom the absence of slavery. But each of these terms must be understood without reference to the other. As long as they retained their independent spiritual character, their religious principles, their internal leadership, and their distinctive way of life, the Jewish people were never truly enslaved, at least not in the spiritual dimension of their existence. The darkness and ignorance of the Middle Ages did nothing to damage, alter, or diminish the spiritual creativity and vitality of the exiled Jewish people. The Jew of this period was persecuted, humiliated, and despised. He had to admit to being weak and helpless in many areas of his life. Nevertheless, his exile was never really complete, for he did not see himself as being contemptible, nor did he consider himself inferior to anyone else. As long as he kept his own essential character, his spiritual word was not merely a comfort to him, it was truly his home. And in this dimension of his life, the exile did not exist. You could be living in you could be living in the mortar of Egypt. You could be living in the muck. You could be living in the most terrible situation, the most difficult circumstances. But our faith is the sweetness to be found in the Charoset. There was a commercial that was released a few years ago promoting vacation, the importance of vacation. I want to share it with you here right now.
I read a study yesterday. It said that last year, more than half of us actually chose not to take our full vacations from our jobs. Question: don't you think it's crazy that so many of us go into work even when we don't need to be there? Times we could be on the beach buried in sand or traveling the earth. We spend it in the office, traveling from desk to desk, buried in paperwork. See, in this chaotic world, everything goes so fast. We're so busy, seems like everyone's middle name is multitask. But now before you go and act all holier than thou, how many extra tabs do you have open on your computer right now? See, we all need time to get away from the race for our family, friends, for the sake of our mental state. Time to rewind, recharge, and reconnect. Not reporting to the office on emails that should be on redirect. Because life, ladies and gentlemen, is all about moments. No one in history has ever been able to hold on to one. Not a single soul. And you never get them back. See? There one goes. No do-over, no rewind, no DVD root menu to skip to a previous scene. Ask yourself, how many trips did you almost take? How many sights have you almost seen? How many moments have you lost thinking about the next one? Thinking that once you get this or get there, maybe that will be the best one. Life has taught me that all we will ever have is now. But let me be perfectly clear. I'm not saying to quit your job, even though I know you deserve a 6-month vacation twice a year. But how about small steps, short trips, with long dances, no distractions. Spend time with family instead of coworkers. Meditation instead of aggravation. Replace our screensavers with sunrises. Palm pilots with palm trees. Jam copy machines with... Man, I really hate jam copy machines. The most precious thing we have in life are moments. Let's make the most of them before they disappear. Let's see the world while we still can, and cherish those while they're still here. Because when our lives are almost over, it won't matter how much money we made, or hours we worked, or times we got Employee of the Month. What we will look back on are the memories we made, the hours we spent with those we loved, and were we Father of the Month, Mother of the Year, Friend of a Lifetime. Holidays should be a time where we go away and come together. From now on, let's take our whole vacation and be fully present, creating memories that will last forever.
I know it's a little bit of a sore subject to talk about vacation these days, but I wonder if the Charoset, the role it plays there, is to set a scene, is to create a moment for us. You see, the great debate whether Charoset itself is a mitzvah or not is sharpened by something that Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe who founded the whole movement, writes in his book called the Shulchan Aruch HaRav. He created this structure for Jewish life, much like the Shulchan Aruch. He updated it, much like the Mishnah Brura. And he writes the following: after eating the karpas, bring before the person reciting the HaGadol, the matzot, so the HaGadol can be recited over them. The Mara should also be placed in front of the person reciting the HaGadol. And we established the Charoset should also be on the table when reciting the HaGadol, because it commemorates the mortar that enslaved our ancestors and the apple that freed them. The Charoset is there to help us understand that our heritage is one in which we are not consumed or defined by negativity, but rather framed by it. The mortar and the tapuach lived together. The Jewish people found sweetness surrounded by sadness. They found love when everything seemed to be lost. The Charoset is on the table for one reason. You want to eat it, you eat it. You want to dip it, you dip it. It is there to be present, to remind us that whatever challenges we face, whatever anxieties we have in our life, we have to focus on the sweetness. We have to focus on the love that exists in our world. You'll notice, if we go back to our Rambam, if we go back to the initial Rambam that we started the whole discussion with. What does he say that we do with the Charoset? Yes, he says the Charoset is to commemorate the mortar. And then he says, what do we do with it? We place it on the table. The Charoset is there largely to create an experience as a reminder for us. And the Charoset is not so different than everything else. Right? If you think about it, everything at the Seder table has a duality to it. Matzah is lechem oni, it's poor man's bread, it's the bread that we ate in Egypt as slaves, and it's the bread that we ate leaving Egypt. Maror, believe it or not, the maror we eat now is actually not that bitter. The reason we eat lettuce is because it started bitter, but it goes from bitter to sweet. We eat even sweet maror. There is a duality to the maror. And then Hillel comes along and says, you got to wrap the maror in the matzah. Because the bitterness is what frames our joy. The difficulty, the challenges, is what helps us focus on the love and the intensity and the relationships and the connections that we have. For so much of our lives, we've lived in relative safety. We've lived in relative calm. For so much of our lives, we've known what to expect from our politicians. We've known what to expect from our healthcare system, from our world. We've lived with a certain level of clarity around what is and what is supposed to be. And last Pesach, all of that was thrown up. Last Pesach, there were people across the world that were having Sidorim by themselves. This Pesach, there still are. Not everyone is able to go to Orlando. Not everyone is able to sit with family this Pesach. We still feel a sense of bitterness of the challenge that we are living through, the once in 100-year challenge. And the Charoset sits there, like everything else at the table, to challenge us to find the tapuach. Right? The Gemara Paskins, quite significantly, look at this. Amar Abaye. Abaye says, which is it? Is it Zeichel Tapuach? Is it Zeichel Tit? Is it to commemorate the love between husband and wife in Egypt? Is it to commemorate the fact that there was intimacy, that there was sweetness even to be found in the midst of slavery? Or is it to commemorate the slavery itself? Abaye says it's to commemorate both. Hilkach tzarich lakahuye utzarich lasamoche. He says the charoset needs to be thick and it needs to be tart. Create a tart to remind us of the tapuach, remind us of the apple orchard and the connection and the family. And it needs to be l'samoche, it needs to be thick to remind us of the mortar. It's necessary for it to be both. Because one without the other means nothing. A few weeks ago, my 5-year-old daughter came up to me with a painting similar to this one, with a picture similar to this one. And she says, look, Abba, I drew a picture of the sun. I said, wow, Amalia, that's a beautiful picture, very talented. And she said, Abba, I have a question for you. Is the sun rising or is the sun setting? And she looked at me. She said, I don't know, Abba. Is the sun rising or is the sun setting? You tell me. I said, I don't know. To me, it looks like the sun is setting. And she stopped and she thought about it for a second. And she said, I think, Abba, you might be right. But I have a question. What does it mean that the sun is setting? This year, some of the challenges we've been experiencing in this pandemic is trying to understand whether we're at the beginning, we're at the end, where exactly are we in this pandemic? Has the sun set or is the sun rising on a new chapter in the pandemic? And though it certainly feels, in Mirz Hashem, please God, we are in the sun-setting stage of this pandemic, I don't know about you, But coming to our second Pesach like this, it feels like a question that's really relevant. Right? How do we continue to focus on the sweetness to be found in the middle of this year? There's an incredible story that's told from last Pesach, true story. It's a woman who became a widow in the pandemic, an older woman. And the family was concerned about her. She lived in Israel. Her children were worried about her going into Pesach last year. And she was resolute. She was resilient. She insisted she's going to be by herself. Those are the rules. And as is the sweet way of our homeland, our precious homeland, Israel, her neighbors across the hallway, in the apartment across the hallway, was a young family. They knocked on her door and said, "We know you're going to be performing the Seder by yourself. Let's keep the doors open so at least you can hear our singing. So at least you can participate in our Seder from a distance." And so they did. They kept the door open, and she listened and she enjoyed listening to their Seder. As soon as the Chag was out, as soon as he was able, this woman's son calls from America and says, "Ima, how was the Seder? We were thinking about you the entire time." And she said, "You'll never believe it. I have these wonderful neighbors who offered to keep their door open so I could listen to the music of their Seder, so I could listen to the songs of their Seder. And you'll never believe it. They sung the same tunes that your Abba sang. So for the first time in 50 years, when I was thinking that I would be by myself for the Seder, I could hear your father's tunes be sung. What a coincidence. How amazing that this family sings our songs, sings our tunes." The son said, "You'll never believe it. On Erev Pesach, this family called me. This family called me and said, we're going to be hosting your mother for Pesach, for the Seder. She's not going to be in our apartment, but she's going to be listening to our tunes. And we understand that this is going to be a hard Seder for her. The first time without her husband for decades. A Seder by herself. Would you take some time and teach us the tunes that your dad sings?" Ima, the reason they sung it was because they wanted to bring some sweetness to your life. They had the forethought to not only open their door to you, but to understand what would be meaningful to you, to hear the songs your husband sang. At the Seder, we say, "Matchil b'gnus u'mesayim b'shvach." We begin by noting the challenges, the difficulties, and we conclude in praise. U'mesayim really means we seal it, means we infuse it. We can't live in a world that is free from gnus. But the Seder insists that we mesayim it b'shvach. The Seder insists that whatever our circumstances, whatever moment we find ourselves in now, we have to be free. Laharos es atzmo. You have to view yourself as a free person. No matter the difficulty, you have to be fully present at the Seder. Whether you are observing the Seder alone, or you're with your immediate family this year, the challenge of the night of faith, of this special night of emunah of faith, is lahagid ba'boker chastecha ve'emunascha ba'leilot. Faith is when we find God in Egypt under the apple tree, and when we find God in this pandemic. Thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you for joining me this evening. And I pray with our entire kehillah, with our entire community, that whatever comes our way, whatever challenges may come down in the future, we be guided by faith, we be inspired by each other, And we spend Pesach evening in the apple orchard, accompanied by God, enjoying his sweet treats, enjoying each other's company, and praying that we always taste the tapuach, we always taste the sweet apple in the Charoset. Wishing everyone a Chag kosher v'sameach. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And stay safe, stay healthy, and most important,